Healthy. You gotta appreciate the weather here. I was just on Baltimore Sunday night for a wedding. It was a snowstorm. It's very scary to drive. I'm not used to it. You slip on the snow. Here, the worst thing that happens is a little bit rain. That's it, or a lot of rain. Anyways, I just wanted to share something very small. We actually learn that everything is going to be eventually for the good in our private lives. Sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes we do see it. But actually, if you look at this week's portion, is the last portion of the book of Genesis or Bereshit in Hebrew. It talks about the last days of the life of Jacob. I'm sure you are all familiar with the story of Joseph and his brothers, right? That his brothers were jealous of him or whatever the reason was, and they actually sold him into slavery. You know, I showed it to my kids. Who's this lady, Hanna Barbera, that has all these cartoons. You know. Yeah. Anyway, so I loved watching them when I was younger. Um, I watched them with my kids also. Anyways, so over there, what happens is actually he was away. Joseph was away from his father for 22 years. The reason why I said his father because his mother died when he was 8 years old. He didn't have a mother; he was an orphan. Anyways, for 22 years, Jacob, his father, was wondering why is God doing this to me. So it took 22 years until there was a famine in Egypt, right? And then they realized the reason why it happened because they had to travel and actually live in Egypt for the next 210 years. That's how you know they made a living and they actually went to the land of plenty. So it took him 22 years to realize why God did this. It's a pretty long time. But one of the things that we do learn is, again, if we believe, again, you have to believe this first. If you believe that anything that happens is from God and God is source of good, even though there's many questions on that with all these wars that's going on in the world, which actually shakes our faith. But if you do really believe in that, there must be eventually something good. So I'm going to share two stories with you. By the way, just as an introduction, you could only look at this for things that happens in our life. I can say God did it for me for a good reason. If somebody else is suffering, I can say, well, God is doing it, so it's for your good. Continue suffering. For other people, we can't do that. For other people, we have to be a human being and help them. When it comes to our own life, we have to accept it in a loving way that it comes from God. So the first story we're going to share actually is a very old story, going back to one of the famous rabbis, Rabbi Akiva. Heard of his name? Rabbi Akiva, right? We still have names of Akiva these days. So he used to say, call the Avid Rahmana, whatever God makes happen is for the good. The story actually happened when one time he was traveling. He had a donkey, it was Mercedes from Germany. I'm just kidding. Maybe it was Rolls Royce. But he had his donkey that he used to carry stuff. He had a rooster that was like an alarm clock, and he always carried a lantern, something to actually learn under its fire, its light at night. So one day he comes to a certain city, it was after the dusk, after the evening, and then they locked all the doors for security reasons. As much as he knocked on the door, nobody opened it up. He had no place to sleep that night. He went to the forest next to the city. While he was studying, suddenly a lion comes and kills his donkey. Then a wild cat comes and eats his rooster. That's it. And then what happens? A wind blows and the fire goes out. So now I can't do nothing. He lost everything. But he still continued saying, whatever God does is for the good. Next morning, when he woke up, he went to the city and he actually saw that there was an army or robbers that attacked. They killed many people and they took many people into captivity. So he says, you know what? I was right. That I said, whatever God does is for the good. If I would have been in the city, the best, I would have been taken as a captive. If the donkey or the rooster were alive and they made noise, the guys would hear the robbers or the army. They would come and investigate. If they would see a light, fire close to the city, they would come after me and catch me. So all these things happened for a good reason. Obviously, it was a loss. He lost his donkey, he lost his rooster, but it was worth it to lose all these in order to have his life saved. You know, similar to a surgery, nobody wants to have surgery. Nobody wants to go through chemo. But if God forbid, why do we even actually pay for it? We even actually wait in line until our turn comes. Because even though it's painful, you know, eventually it's for the better. We will live a longer life. So that's one story that actually there was a loss, but it was for the better good. Now, sometimes certain things that happen, it seems to be bad, but it's actually very good. Now, this is a very strange, weird story that happens in the Talmud. You know, if you guys have studied when the Romans actually ruled over the entire world, so they were not democratic people, that's for sure. Very big tyrants. You study this history, was just ruthless. Even amongst themselves, they had many, many wives, and one wife, really liked her son to take over, so they would actually poison the Caesar and make sure that the son. It was really ugly time of history at that time. So they actually, one of the things that they did, there was one time they ruled over Israel, and they made a very bad decree against the Jews. So they decided to send a very holy man, take a gift to the emperor, to the Caesar, and ask him for forgiveness. So they chose a man that his name was Nahum. And they called him Nahum, the man who's Gamzu. Gamzu means this also. Whatever happened, he said, this is for the good too. In Hebrew, the ones that speak Hebrew, Gamzu letova. This is for the good too. That's whatever he said, even at the hardest times. So they choose him to go to the emperor. He has a whole chest full of, jewelry, diamonds, whatever it is. On the way, he sleeps in a motel. And they realize there's something valuable in this. So at night, they go into his room, they empty it out, they fill it up with dust. Next morning, he goes to the emperor and he says, what, I'm coming from the Jews. Please forgive us. They open up the chest. I don't know why I didn't realize. I have no idea. The sea is full of dust. What, Jews came to make fun of me? So they throw him into jail to see what they're going to do to him. So, the stories in the olden days, these open miracles used to happen. So Elijah the prophet, that's what the Talmud says. He comes in a shape or in a figure of one of his soldiers, and he says, listen, whatever you want to say about the Jews, I accept. But listen, he's not stupid to come make fun of you when he's in trouble. Probably this dust is something special. What's special about this? Because I've studied, when Abraham, in the Bible we learn, he went to war against 4 kings. And the Bible tells us he was alone with another 318 people. How could 319 people, including Abraham, overcome an army of 4 nations? So the legend is that he used to take a dust that God made a miracle for him, and he threw the dust. It turned into spears and whatever it was, and he killed all the enemies. So this guy, Elijah the prophet, says probably that's the dust. At that time, Rome had a war against one of the countries that couldn't take over. They tried. And it happens. Miracle happens, they win the war. So they take the decree off the Jews, and actually they give him the diamonds. Some diamonds to take back. Now this story, actually, it seems to be a little bit different story. Rabbi Akiva lost his donkey. He had a financial loss, but it was for the good. I'm going to ask you a question. Imagine he would have taken the diamonds to the Roman Caesar. Would he be impressed? Do you think? No. Maybe yes, maybe not. He's not lacking diamonds. When they conquered all the countries, they took all the riches into his palace. So that wouldn't impress him. But he was in the middle of a war, and actually that ammunition did impress him. So it wasn't only that it was a loss for a bigger good, that itself was good. So if you have that outlook, actually, we could accomplish this. Many things that happen in the world actually is what our mindset is. Actually, I was listening to one of my rabbis. You might be familiar with it. I really don't know this. They said there was one time a flight from Chicago to California. It was one of those big tragedies that the airplane crashed. So there was one guy, in those days, I guess the computers were not so exact. This is maybe in the 70s. I don't know when it was. I heard this in the 90s, and that was before. So, they used to oversell tickets. And then when he came, they said, sorry, he's overbooked. You're bumped off the plane. You got to go at a different flight. So this guy comes and he has no place because they bumped him off. And he says, I have a meeting in California. He says, well, sorry, we can't do anything. You could get on the next plane. You're going to get there 9 o'clock at night. But my meeting is before 6. They couldn't do anything. He was cursing everyone, the stewardesses and the agents and everybody. Less than 2 hours later, the news came that the airplane crashed and nobody survived. Not the passengers and not the pilots, none of the stewardesses. So instead of cursing everybody, he was walking around, thanking God and thanking everyone that bumped him off the plane. It was a tragedy. Many people passed away, but for him, it was a good thing that he didn't get on the airplane. I'm sure either yourselves, but you must be very young. You guys are young, you might not know. But please ask your parents, ask your grandparents. They'll definitely share a story with you that in the beginning it seemed to be awful. But at the end, because we believe everything comes from God, eventually was for our good.